Can you hear me? Yay! Hello. Hi. What a nice audience. Well, I wonder how often you have found yourselves on a country road. Maybe you didn't expect to be there. And you see a tractor out in the field. I should go to a slide here. You see a tractor out in the field or maybe a cow out there grazing in the pasture. And I don't know, maybe you think, hey, that's cool. I do. No surprise there. I also grew up on a small farm. So for me, it's a very nostalgic idea to think about the small family farm. Many of us have that ideal somewhere in our minds. In reality, we have a very complex food system in the United States and globally. Especially in this country, it is filled with very large farms, often thousands of acres, monocropped. We also have large concentrated animal feeding operations with thousands of animals at times, sometimes put into one barn. That is not nostalgia. That is not pastoral. That is business. This is a reality we need to acknowledge. Now, you and I typically go to the grocery store, pick up the foods we're looking for, and make recipes that we feel like making, and we may not even think about what the time of year it is, whether it's a natural ingredient for us to be able to acquire during that time. In fact, usually they come thousands of miles away, many of these ingredients, even when they are in season. So for us to be wiser consumers as food consumers, we need to know more about this system. And the food system is a good representation of many of the systems in which we operate as consumers. So we're going to look at this a little bit further. So let's talk about the farm itself. Initially, I just want to share with you that farming, agriculture in general, as well as the land clearing for agriculture, is often said to already generate somewhere between 25 and 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally. Those are ranges and they're guesses. And when we start to add the rest of the food system into that calculation, it's going to be higher. So it's important for us to plug in and figure out what is going on in each of these ways. Now, at the farm, you can tell there's a lot of different activities. And one of the big ones, that are typical ones at a farm level, is to plow the field. Plowing the field disturbs the soil, releases carbon, disturbs the underlying biome, which can otherwise sequester carbon. And so we get kind of a double whammy problem in that respect with plowing. We separately rely on mechanization for most of our agriculture in the developed world. That's for plowing, for planting seeds, for spreading chemicals, for harvests. More and more, we rely on mechanization over labor. And these typically run on fossil fuels. So we have another source of greenhouse gas emissions. The chemicals. Oh, I'm Debbie Downer right now. The chemicals themselves have their own manufacturing story with energy consumption, greenhouse gas. You start hearing me say energy consumption, we're talking about typically fossil fuel related energy creation and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. So they have their own story off farm. On farm, they also have effects on biodiversity. And when they are plant-oriented issues, we also have, another little layer of removing some of the carbon sequestration abilities of our natural landscape. Yeah, this is terrible. Let's talk also about those cows. Love them, right? Beautiful beasts. I grew up with them. They are amazing. They also belch a lot of methane. They not only create that methane themselves, they're also responsible for an enormous chunk of the consumption of the crops grown on that other land. So they're like a double whammy problem of greenhouse gas emissions. It gets worse. If you're in a concentrated animal feeding operation setting, there's also pools of manure that need to be managed. And if you're talking about the feeding lot systems that are typical in the Southwest, we also have transportation of animals back and forth during a very short life. Goodness gracious. So what happens next after the farm? Boy, am I concentrating an enormous supply chain into one slide. This is a very lengthy chain in some cases. The farmer's produce, let's say, has to go somewhere. If it's going to show up to you as a whole pepper in a store, it's at least going to go to a processing facility where it's washed, probably bagged in some way. But a lot of what goes into the food system is transformed dramatically, where we don't really recognize what the raw ingredients were. So we really should plug in initially to that alone, that we don't really understand what goes into the food that we eat often, right? We also have a very transportation-heavy sector. Food comes from all over the world. It transfers itself between, well, we do it, transfers itself between different points of action, different levels of value added. And then when we look at what happens to it, we're also talking about packaging. If we're talking about cardboard, we're talking about pulp from trees. If it's a virgin forest, we're talking about cutting down trees that could have sequestered carbon. If we're talking about plastics, we're talking about the whole petroleum story. And then let's add the grocery store in there just because we have to, right? That's where we know. That's the place we know. How many of you have walked into a grocery store and been able to pick something out of a refrigerated case without opening a door? It's very convenient. But all that cold air, of course, is not being used efficiently in the display of food for us, right? So these are little moments of problems, if you will, and poor use of energy, most of which has been generated with fossil fuels or some level of greenhouse gas emissions overall. Does this leave us off the hook? I mean, really, we went to the grocery store and picked up our gallon of milk. We didn't do all that stuff, right? I mean, something is going on. No, we got to roll the play. You know I was going there. So on the one hand, we can just say, well, we take their foods as are. This is what they've given us, and we'll buy them. But realistically, most of us get into a vehicle and we drive to a grocery store. And if it's the only thing you did on that trip out, your entire gasoline usage was about your food choices. All right, not everybody drives to the store, but you bring your groceries home. We put them into our refrigerators, plug that refrigerator in. Hopefully it's efficient. Those refrigerators are getting larger and larger every year. We forget what's in the back, right? That's what happened to those strawberries. Okay, and this is really the big piece for us. We are food wasters. This is our big piece, is we don't take seriously the quantity of food that we have obtained. And that means everything I just told you, from plowing all the way through, that generated greenhouse gas emissions, was for nothing. That's really got to make us stop, right? Pause and think about, what are we doing when we waste food? And we all do it. Well, there are impacts of all of this that are going to come around and haunt us as well. Because in the end, climate change is making it harder for farmers to grow food. Water resources are getting more scarce, difficult to align with where agriculture has been happening. Pests are able to proliferate that much more in warmer temperatures. And even the yield process, the growing process of the crops, is different under warmer conditions. And eventually, certain areas will not have the ability to produce what it has typically produced. We're at least going to be looking at localized, if not broader, supply shortages and price increases. And we're bringing this on ourselves. We all want to eat. So I could go on for hours, I won't, about agricultural policies that need to change. In this country, we have supported our agricultural system in a very traditional way for decades. We can do much better, and we can level the playing field for those farmers who want to do something different. For those that are engaging with regenerative agriculture, for example, we could make that playing field maybe even tilt a little bit in their favor. But okay, I need to move on to other actions that we can all engage with. So I have a handful to suggest. There's more. I'd love to hear them after the event if you've got other ideas for what we can do. First of all, I would encourage you to know where your food comes from. Partly that's about distance, and maybe you cannot give up your avocados from Mexico. But if you can't give them up, maybe you can find other things that you can make substitutions for. Things for which there's a more localized option, for example, or things that don't lead you to the same level of waste. Make those decisions. Secondly, that double whammy that is livestock production, perhaps we can reduce our consumption of meat. There are amazing options out there. And maybe you can't do that fully, but you could maybe try a meatless Monday or something along those lines so that you can have that additional impact or make sure to reduce your impacts in terms of your consumption. Third, I would encourage you to invest in your local farm community. I don't mean you need to buy a piece of a farm, but if you go to roadside stands, talk to the farmers, learn about their methods, engage them in conversation, maybe even suggest some things you'd like to see differently. You'll learn about your local community, the things that are happening. You'll get fresh produce. If you want, you could buy a share in community-supported agriculture and get a box of wonderful produce each week. And then you really are engaging in localized solutions. Maybe you want to grow your own food. Okay, it's not for everybody, but I have seen people with very productive pots of tomatoes on balconies of high-rise apartment buildings. You can grow food in many places other than what you think. And a community garden in a city context would be another example. Engage heavily, you might even be able to preserve some of it so that you're eating it off season. Fifth, make a meal plan each week. Can't you look at your week and say, oh boy, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, so busy. I'm going to need some solutions. I need to do something differently than just buy food, stock my fridge, and watch it go to waste because I wasn't actually home or home long enough to cook it. So let me think ahead, and I'm much more likely to not waste what I purchased if I do that kind of planning. Lastly, I want to encourage you to actually be an agent for change. Go to your local county fair. Meet with representatives. They could be 4-H folks, extension folks that are really connected to the land, the farmers themselves. It could be your local representatives or state or federal representatives, and you can share your thoughts. They need to hear us if those agricultural policies that I promised not to talk much about are going to change, right? So we need to be doing that as well. So this is going to take all of us. We need to do the research on our own choices. We need to have our consumer voices heard. If we push for the type of changes that we're talking about, we might be able to keep this from just being nostalgia. Thank you.